Alright, buckle up, because I've got a lot to talk about. In the lead up to spooky season, I asked my patrons to vote on a book that I should revisit, something that I loved in the past, and it's been too long since I've reread it, and they voted for Dracula. Now that Halloween is here, it was time for me to revisit it. And what I found was something very, very interesting. See, I have a distinct memory of reading Dracula. It was 2016, so 7 years ago, and I was living in Shanghai at the time. I remember buying this copy in London and throwing it in my suitcase and telling myself, I'll read it when I'm in China. I lived there for a year, and during that time, yeah, I read this, and I enjoyed it, and I thought, okay, great, I like horror, I like spooky stuff, I want to read more classic books, and so I read Dracula, and it was good. But I didn't really think much more than that. One thing I really remember loving about the book was the epistolary style, the fact that this entire novel is written as a series of letters, journals, diary entries, cutouts from magazines, telegrams, and that's a lot of fun. At the time when I read this, I don't think I'd read many epistolary stories, and it took me by surprise that a classic like this was written in that style, and I loved it, and for that, the book really stayed with me. But that was all that really stuck with me. Now, as a colossal fan of all things Gothic, I have finally reread Dracula and looked at it with really new eyes. In case you've never read it, Dracula begins with a man named Jonathan Harker. He's a trainee solicitor from Exeter, and he's been sent by his boss, who couldn't make the journey, to Romania, to Transylvania specifically, to deal with a kind of complex business transaction with this mysterious count who lives in a big castle. This Count Dracula, has bought a house in East London and wants to move there and live there, and they need to finalise all of the business stuff. And for the first 3 chapters, we follow Harker. We read his journal as he travels through Europe and arrives at the castle. And right from the beginning, this is a really, really fun horror thriller. It wastes absolutely no time in establishing the mood and the tone and the general vibes. Harker remarks in his journal that when he meets people on his way there and he tells them where he's going, they do the sign of the cross. They share superstitions, they look afraid, and he doesn't quite know why. Before reaching the castle, he is set upon by wolves, and eventually he gets there, and he meets Dracula, and Dracula welcomes him in and speaks wonderful English and tells him he's excited to move to London and talks about himself a little bit. And then we spend a few dozen pages in this castle. Dracula is a mysterious figure. Jonathan figures that out very, very quickly. He sees that Dracula doesn't have a reflection. He notes that there's no one else here, no one else to make him his meals, and yet he's eating every day. So it must be Dracula making them, but Dracula himself never eats anything? This is all happening within the first few dozen pages, and it's already very creepy, very frightening. As I said, it doesn't waste time. And yet the book is pretty long. It's about 400 pages long. But this opening act is really intense. It's a very fun horror thriller. It sends chills down your spine. There is a moment while Jonathan is there that he is set upon by 3 vampire women who just happen to live in the castle. And Dracula manages to lure them away by handing them a sack that definitely contains a human child for them to eat. It's really twisted, it's really messed up, and honestly, I don't remember this from when I first read it. This opening section of the book ends when Harker finds that there is a room in the castle that is full of these coffins, these caskets that are full of dirt, and Dracula is lying in one of them. Eventually, Harker says in his journal that he's going to try and run away, and he might even try and climb through a window to escape. And then we shift to the perspective of Jonathan Harker's fiancée, who is back home in England. In fact, she's in Whitby, a town that sits on the coast in Yorkshire, a town that I've been to and is really, really pretty and lovely. Her name is Mina, and she is there with her friend Lucy, and Lucy's mother. Lucy and Mina have been sharing letters back and forth, and those letters are just exposition to let you know a bit about these women and what they're up to. And what I really, really liked immediately is the very first thing that Mina talks about is work. Now, I should say that I didn't find the female characters in this book half as compelling as the men, or half as well written. Bram Stoker did not know how to write women. The letters from the women's perspective are kind of obnoxiously bland, and there is this horrible habit that he has of writing women swooning over men, all the men in the book, all the men that the women talk about are just perfect and wonderful and magical, and aren't we women so lucky to have these wonderful men in our lives? Aren't they all perfect? Men can do no wrong, blah blah blah. However, Mina, despite being poorly written and her narrative voice being really bad and kind of awkwardly stupid, she does talk about work. She represents a new woman. She represents change. Because this book was written in 1897, and at that time, the role of the woman in society, the role of the woman in the household, it was all slowly changing. And she kind of embodies all of that, and it shows that Bram Stoker was excited about that and interested in it and wanted to write about it. So for a novel of its time, Stoker is showing support for womanhood within society, to a point at least, while definitely not being very talented at writing women at all. So that's a double-edged sword. Now I'm going to stop talking about the plot in a second, but I do want to mention the fact that while these women are in Whitby, Mina takes an article from the local newspaper and glues it into her journal so we get to read it. And that article talks about a ship that has basically just crashed into Whitby Harbour. And it talks about what was experienced on that ship. This ship carried Dracula with it. And on this long journey from Russia to England, men on the ship started to see things. They started to argue that there was a monster on board, a creepy man stalking people, and they get picked off one by one until all that's left is the captain, who lashes himself to the helm of the ship in order to get it where it needs to go. That's kind of his final act. But Dracula is on this ship and he's stalking and killing off these men one by one, and it is absolutely thrilling to imagine. And from there, when he arrives in England on this now empty vessel, Dracula starts stalking Whitby, and he picks Mina's friend Lucy as a target, and he starts drinking her blood, and she gets sicker and sicker and sicker. And with that, we get the introduction of the iconic character Van Helsing, who in this book is very different from other pop culture depictions of him. He's a really fun old man. He's a very, very good character, and he kind of represents the yang to Dracula's yin in a lot of different ways, in a lot of really fun and satisfying ways to read. That's all I'll say about the plot. That's enough to reel you in. Now, as I've said with regards to criticisms, the women in this book are poorly written, but I also respect what Stoker was doing. But there's a lot more to examine. Dracula really took me by surprise with its epistolary style when I first read it, and that completely remains true here. But what's interesting is that the book doesn't have that much of a poetic or linguistic flair to it. You see, I've talked 1,000 times about the fact that Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is my favourite novel. I'm a big, big fan of Frankenstein. But popular culture and the zeitgeist of the 20th century has kind of smushed these two books together. Dracula and Frankenstein are often talked about in the same breath, and I totally understand why. They're both Gothic novels. They were both written in the 19th century, although on polar ends of that century. And I think most importantly, they are two books that created and established two very, very iconic monsters within popular culture. When people dress up for Halloween, the iconic costumes are the vampire, which usually looks like how Dracula is often depicted, and the Frankenstein's monster. They are two very recognizable aesthetics, and they established the concept of the monster in our popular 20th century Halloween zeitgeist. So these books do have a lot in common, but they're very, very, very different. One of the many reasons I love and go crazy over Frankenstein is the thematic depth of the book, and I've read it like 5 times. Every time I read it, I pick up something new to explore and unearth and think about, blah, blah, blah. Dracula is a little bit more shallow. There are really cool themes to explore, and I will do, but it definitely lacks the really intense thematic depths that Frankenstein manages to plunder. And also, it's just not as well written. I love the epistolary style, absolutely adore it, and I think that carries a lot when it comes to this book. But maybe because it's epistolary, or just because of how Stoker writes, there is a lack of poetry, and I would say a lack of eccentricity sometimes in this book. You don't have to just compare Dracula to Frankenstein to see that. You could also compare it to the works of the Brontes. Gothic fiction is overblown. Characters talk in these absurd, eccentric, over-the-top ways that make them kind of camp and even goofy sometimes, and I absolutely love it. It's one of the things I adore about the Gothic, and I would say Dracula kind of lacks some of that. The big obsession of the cast of characters in Dracula is love and friendship. These people really love talking about love. As I've said, the women fawn over the men and how perfect and wonderful and kind and generous and valiant, I guess, these men are. But the men do it to each other as well, constantly throwing each other compliments, constantly talking about the importance of friendship and loyalty and all of these things. And it's kind of twee, and it kind of awkwardly stands in opposition to the horror tone of it and to the dark, sinister Gothic nature of it, because another really important aspect to the Gothic is horrible, unlikable characters. People who are broken and twisted and gnarled and beautifully hateable, like Frankenstein himself, like Heathcliff. These people are monsters. And Van Helsing is certainly not that. Van Helsing is likable and fun. And this book also often feels more like an adventure story than a Gothic horror thing. It certainly starts off very Gothic horror, but that doesn't last forever. So the tone and the language is definitely lacking. But I cannot overemphasize how much I love the epistolary style of it and how much that really does carry. But I can't let go of the way that Stoker writes his women. The fact that these women are so bland is irritating. But also, Jonathan Harker at the beginning of the book has a real trapped and imprisoned fairy tale princess vibe about him. He's kind of been emasculated by Dracula. He stumbles into a trap, he's locked in a castle, and he needs saving. It's a complete inversion of the knight saves the princess trope, and people don't seem to talk about that when it comes to Dracula. I certainly don't see it. And I think it's awesome, the fact that Bram Stoker was happy to kind of emasculate his first male protagonist that appears in the book. And it's also at this point that you see how Dracula represents certain others. There's a lot of ways that you can read Dracula as a character. A popular way to look at him as a character and what he thematically represents, and one that I totally agree with, is the kind of post-British Empire embodiment of immigration. Strange foreign people with strange foreign customs, religions, traditions, coming over here to the UK and bringing their weirdness with them. And Dracula certainly does embody that as a character. He's a frightening force that murders other people, drains them of their blood, and is able to turn those people into his underlings, into his army of vampires. There's so much to unpack there when it comes to theme. The fear of waves of immigrants moving into your country and turning it into something alien and unrecognizable, using their culture to override your culture, all this bullshit scaremongering that goes on to this day all over the world, and especially in the UK. All that stuff was embodied through the character of Dracula over 100 years ago, and it's really, really compelling as a thematic thing to explore. But Dracula also represents queerness. There is a suaveness and an eccentricity to him, and it is undeniably kinky the way that he behaves. He is frightening, but also seductive. He is a strange other thing that should be feared, but is also charming, is also enticing, is also very intelligent. The idea of being afraid of your own sense of temptation when it comes to the queer other is really, really compelling in this book. The idea of being tempted by this strange, twisted, monstrous queer thing, it is delicious the way that it's explored, and I really, really enjoy it. The ways in which queer people, especially in the past few years, have kind of attached ourselves to the vampire in its aesthetics, in its themes, in the ways that it's been depicted. It's absolutely fascinating, and you could write essays on it, and I'm sure people have. The different things that Dracula represents as a concept of otherness is absolutely massive. The other in terms of gender and sexuality, but also the other in terms of race and migration and culture. It's huge and it's brilliant, and I'm sure most of it was intended by the author, and I think that's awesome. He's examining all of this, but I don't really know to what end. But it's also very clear that he was writing about women, at least, in a kind of, I would say, productive and progressive way. So if he's being progressive, at least to a point with regards to women, but also not wholly successfully, and there are regressive elements to the way that he writes his women as well. Like I said, they are cardboard cutouts that worship worship men, that's a problem. But if he does have a kind of eye to the future when it comes to women, I assume that the way he depicts Dracula, and Dracula embodying the kind of scaremongering when it comes to immigration, I'm sure a lot of that was intentional. Was he writing Dracula as a symbol of something you should be feared, or was he being almost satirical with it? I don't know. And I'd love to hear what you think, and if you've read stuff I haven't read, let me know in the comments. One other thing I want to talk about is the length of the book. It's definitely not consistent. It could have done with a lot of editing. It has pacing issues. Some of that is certainly of the time, but also this book was written later than you think. I often convince myself that it was written in the early 19th century, but in fact it was written and published at the turn of the 20th century, so it's a little bit more modern than you often think it is, or at least I do. So in that regard, there are fewer excuses for why it feels so plodding at times, and the pacing could have been tightened up a lot. But again, the thing I keep returning to, that epistolary style really does carry a lot of weight. Because every character has a different way of speaking and therefore a different way of writing and a different amount of detail they want to put into their letters and their journals. But you cannot deny the fact that they do go on a lot. And I think the biggest problem with those pacing issues is the fact that, again, this detracts from the gothic and horror tone of it. At the beginning, when we just have Harker's journal, everything's terrifying. All of the time. It's really scary and really exciting. But take in the first half, Lucy getting progressively more and more sick, and it's a big mystery as to why. That stuff goes on and on and on, and while she's sick, new characters get introduced, Van Helsing being the big one, but it drags so much, and Lucy gets better and then worse, and then better and then worse, and better and worse, and better and worse, and better and then worse, so many fucking times that I completely lost interest in her as a character and what was actually going on. So much of it could have been cut. Oh god, it goes on. So Dracula's not perfect. At all. Far from it. But it's an important book. And as I've said, all of these themes are so important to examine. And the way in which Stoker wrote this just absolute evil antagonist. And that's why this sometimes doesn't feel gothic, because as I've said, a host of gothic characters should be a batch of unlikable, horrible people doing horrible things. And in Dracula, that's not the case, so it feels more horror than gothic. Instead of it being traditionally gothic, it's a horror novel about a group of people being preyed upon and trying to fight back against this evil monster. And that's really, really cool. It's really fun. So as I'm talking about it now, I'm thinking that Dracula really needs to be described more as a horror novel than a gothic novel. Let me know again what you think about that and if I'm completely wrong there. But Dracula is a thriller, it's an adventure story, and it's a horror story. I'm not sure I agree anymore with branding it as gothic, and that's really interesting. Rereading Dracula has been so much fun. I've had so many things to think about, and honestly, I could keep talking, but I feel like I've been talking for a while, so I'm gonna stop here. Ultimately, Dracula is a really, really fun and engaging story with a massive cast of characters written in a really fun and addictive epistolary style, with this ultimate evil monster thing draining blood, chasing people across countries, and inspiring so much about our popular culture when it comes to horror and monsters. Like, the legacy of Dracula is almost too big to put into words. And I think that's awesome. Rereading the book has been so much fun, and I'm so glad I did. If you've never read Dracula, you need to. Absolutely, it is 100% worth a read. But reading it twice has been very, very eye-opening in terms of the things that I don't like about the book, and also the thematic things that I just completely missed and didn't think about the first time round. Rereading it has been invaluable, honestly. So check it out. Please, please read Dracula. Now is the time. It's Halloween. Go. And if you want to vote on what book I reread next, you can join my Patreon. And as always, subscribe for books.